5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Almassian. I'm happy that today I'm joined by Fiorella Isabel. She's an American journalist based in Moscow, and she is also a geopolitical analyst, and she has been following the recent events, I would say dramatic events in Russia very closely, and she reported accurately on her Twitter account. And her reporting, in my opinion, was comprehensive. I will also put the link of her thread in the description below. And today we're going to discuss the dramatic events in Russia, and I want to really know and dig in whether what happened yesterday was a rebellion, a coup, attempted coup, or a psyop, as many people also say nowadays on Twitter. Fiorella, thank you very much for being my guest, first of all.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, an eventful 36 hours that it's been thus far. So,
Actually, it was in my opinion, yesterday what happened was horrifying. I was terrified because
mhm,
chaos in Russia, the chaos in Russia can split over to entire Europe. Lots of people do not
mhm,
understand that chaos and disintegration of the Russian Federation will have a negative repercussions on the security of the entire European continent, even on the countries that a lot of people hate Russia. And I can see that there is some Russophobia from their side. So they are
mhm,
wishing that Russia would be disintegrated, but they're not really realizing that this could affect on them directly while they live in other, let's say, Eastern European countries or Western European
mhm,
countries. So as we said, Russia lived scary moments in the past 48 hours as the head of the Wagner mercenary group moved against the Russian army, occupied a few military sites, and started marching to Moscow. This was the claims. Now, there are two narratives in this regard. I want to show the first narrative that lots of people believe in, and it was also explained by Kim.com here. He says this is his view. This started as a power struggle between Prigozhin and Shoigu. In the beginning of the special military operation, Shoigu and his team made mistakes, and Prigozhin became a strong critic of Shoigu. Prigozhin then had success in Bakhmut, with Wagner Group presenting himself as a better military leader than Shoigu. In my view, Shoigu then provoked Prigozhin by limiting ammunition supplies to Bakhmut, resulting in Wagner Group losses and a strong reaction from Prigozhin. Many of you have seen the video of Prigozhin attacking Shoigu and the Russian military leadership. So there were lots of, I would say, disagreements between the MOD of Russia, according to this narrative, and also with the head of the Wagner. And this was more of a personal disagreements between them and conflict, which led into desperate move by Prigozhin, who declared a rebellion against the Russian government. But the other narrative says that those who got fooled yesterday do not understand the Russian soul and even less social engineering tactics. Prigozhin was Putin's cook and earned millions by Putin's aid. That alone was an indicator strong enough to suggest those guys trusted each other like brothers and made it all up. It was a big show. Two, full Western mainstream media and politicians identify traitors and legitimize extended war laws. Now, as a journalist in Moscow, how do you describe what happened? Was it the beginning of a civil war? Was it a rebellion? Was it a mutiny? Was it a psyop? How do you see it from there?
yeah. So, this is something that I've been even discussing with friends of mine, and everybody has a different opinion. When I reported on this, I based it on what was actually happening on the ground and what we were getting from people there, what I was getting from people that were directly in Moscow and were seeing exactly what was going on. Now, the reality is that I think initially you could have argued for the psyop situation, but I just don't see it as logical as having the president of Belarus involved in this, having the entirety of the military commandment involved in, and having pretty much supported Putin against Prigozhin's. I would call it an attempted mutiny. I would call it a rebellion. I would definitely not call it a civil war. I definitely wouldn't call it even, I wouldn't even call it a coup, to be honest, because it really didn't have anything to do with replacing Putin. It had everything to do with, as was mentioned in the first tweet, Shoigu. Prigozhin and Shoigu did not get along, and Prigozhin has done countless videos for nearly a year, saying really disturbing things. He started talking about the war in Ukraine in terms of the Ukrainians not slaughtering Russians for 8 years. He started basically giving all of these talking points. And so, what I would say was there any sort of intelligence outside of Russia involved? Perhaps British intelligence, perhaps something like that, because the way Prigozhin was talking was disturbing. And I know for a fact that the FSB had already launched investigations because they were already suspect of what was going on, and they did discover these terrorist cells that were supposed to um, uh, attack around the same time Prigozhin would be entering Moscow, which is extremely suspect. And the FSB is always ahead of the game in terms of this. They weren't going to allow these videos to be
Hmm.
publicized and not do anything about it. Putin wasn't going to stand by, not do anything, if they thought this was a threat. Russia acts, I think a lot of people don't understand how the Russians work in terms of government. They're very diplomatic. They are the opposite of what the West is. They're an extremely logical people. They go move about quietly. They don't make any noise. In the West, we go in and we attack right away, and we make sure everyone knows it, and that's how we do things. But in Russia, they're almost too diplomatic to a sense. They try to resolve things in a very quiet manner, and that's what I think we're seeing here. I just don't think that all of these individuals, including the president of Belarus and Putin, would really put out an entire 5D chess tactical thing. And I think this is the tendency now, because especially coming from the West, especially in my opinion, that there is some sort of underlying psyop going on, because we've been through so many, we've seen so many in recent years, that now we're like, oh my gosh, could everything be a psyop? But I also think, in a way, that discredits the reality of things, that there are internal conflicts in Russia, just like there are in every country in the world. Even the most fully formed, most cohesive governments have internal conflicts. And this internal conflict in Russia, in my opinion, has been ongoing for a long time. This is a conflict where you have a Soviet type of bureaucratic system, but still in a capitalist economy. So you have these elements coming together, and you have the Russian oligarchs, you have, the Russian elite, and Putin has been treading this line very well. Putin is a man that was born during the Soviet times, but he is more of a, I would say, some people view him as a liberal for Russia, but in terms of that, I honestly think he's more of like a socially conservative, you know, I would say somebody that is socially conservative, but economically, Russia has a lot of state funded initiatives and incentives for their people. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think he's been treading along with the old way of governing and the new way, which I think it's something that a lot of people aren't looking at. And so it's easier to say, well, maybe, Prigozhin was nobody and Putin has a deal with him and blah blah blah. I can see why that would be something to think about, because a lot of the things people were pointing out was like there were no casualties. Russia just seemed very calm. Why didn't they go after him? All of these things, but all of those things could also be explained just by how Russians do politics. You will never see them out front go and doing something front and center. And so I think a lot of people don't understand the dynamic. So that's why it's easier to think that. But there are a lot of things on the ground that suggest that Prigozhin was either compromised in some way, but even if he wasn't compromised in some way, at the very least, he was very upset for several reasons. He really didn't like Shoigu and his interactions. You have to remember, Prigozhin hasn't really had a lot of experience fighting. He never did. He's just like the front man of this whole operation, the face. And Prigozhin was upset because Russia is incorporating the mercenaries, the Wagner group, into their Ministry of Defense. And why would Russia do this? Well, precisely because of this,
Hmm.
because you can't have mercenaries going around. I mean, this is, I think, a mistake made. A lot of people don't believe Russia should have had the Wagner group, although they have been successful in parts of Africa. They've had statues commemorated in their for their, their help in Africa, but they're a very controversial group outside of that. And although many of them are Russian, if not most of them, I do think that having people that you pay is different than having, them within the ranks of your own military confinement. And so Russia was trying to incorporate them via a deadline a few weeks ago, and Prigozhin didn't want to do that either. So there is a real, like, internal squabble, but I do think that there are definitely outside factors, and the whole story does seem quite incredible when you try to just take what's given. I do think there are things that we don't know and that are not being said, but I don't think it's one gigantic psyop, because in spite of this, this really helped Ukraine. In terms of helping Ukraine, it helped them in the sense of seeing the weaknesses in Russia, and the perceived weaknesses. It helped the entire Western world. Look at what Russia's doing. Look at this guy. They're not as cohesive as we would like. I don't think that's something you would want to show the entirety of the world. I don't really think the benefits that you would get out of that are really overcome the consequences and negative consequences. So that's why I don't really believe in the psyop scenario as of this moment. I just don't think so.
Fiorella, you mentioned something very important, that the Russian senior, let's say, diplomats or the leaders are very diplomatic. And in terms of dealing, for example, in the past at least 1 decade since the eruption of the Ukraine war, which started in 2014, unlike what the mainstream media claims today. And I have seen a criticism of Putin by, for example, Alexander Dugin, who is more radical than the current elites in Moscow. And Prigozhin, for example, is also, he became a critic, let's say, of Shoigu. But there are so many critical voices from Moscow who say that Putin was too late in his offensive on Ukraine, and they were
Mhm.
pushing him to start this military operation earlier. They say that Putin is being too diplomatic and too soft with the West, and see where the West has what do they wish now for Russia, right? So there is also this argument that I'm not, of course, calling for radical policies, but the opposition to Putin is also coming from more radical elements. So do you think that Putin is more playing here a balancing role in the Russian politics? Is this
Mm.
the right approach, or Russia should escalate more with the West, in your opinion, or be more bold in its actions?
It's hard to say, because I do think Putin is playing a balancing act. Because even if you, as a journalist, if you're there, you're going to see the opinions of other people that say Putin needs to be more aggressive, and it's not just, people who are in the know. It's civilians. A lot of civilians feel like Putin needs to be more aggressive. A lot of civilians are upset that Yevgeny Prigozhin was not arrested, that he wasn't, and that the Wagner PMC group is still going to be there. They're not happy about that. They see them as traitors. There are sectors of the population that are extremely radical, and that said, you need to just eliminate them all. They can't be trusted. But these are people primarily who are not in the military. And again, when you go from the military mindset to the Russian political mindset, the Russian political mindset, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from everybody in near Putin's side, they're extremely diplomatic. They have been, even in the beginning, they were begging, hey, let's just have talks, let's just have talks, let's just have talks, let's just have talks, which is why the narrative that Russia just, had an illegal invasion is so false, because they tried at every turn to do this, even at the anger of the population, who was saying, you need to go in now, you need to go in now. They're slaughtering Russians in Donbass. So there's definitely this tug and pull that he has to walk through, and this line he has to go through, because it's the thing is, it's when you're a leader, you can't act like Yevgeny Prigozhin. That's the thing. Yevgeny Prigozhin may work in the military, but he wouldn't work as a leader. There were people saying, oh, that he was going to be president and all this stuff, which was completely unfounded, because this in no way was about Putin. And so, but with Yevgeny Prigozhin, he's extremely emotional, and I think Putin has been successful. In fact, even though, I don't necessarily 100% align myself all the way with him politically, I do think that he has been an effective leader. This is why I think he's so well respected by many people in Russia. And I asked, Russians, like, how do you feel right now about what's happening? Because a lot of the media, including independent media on social media, on Twitter, were saying a lot of things, that Putin left, that there was going to be martial law, that, he was marching in with 25,000 men, that Yevgeny Prigozhin was marching in with 25,000 men. And none of that was true. Out of the 25,000 men, maybe 5,000 or less joined him, and they were basically there for hours. When people were saying, oh, he's almost there, they had stopped for hours, and they were already negotiating with Lukashenko, and they were, talking. I don't think that Prigozhin expected to have this little support if he was serious about this. And I think there's a reason why he did this. We have to think about, is he that dumb or to do this and think he was going to be successful? Why would he think that way? Or he's smart, but he had some other assurances that would allow him to do this. And so I think when it comes to Russia, you are going to have a lot of the people, and a lot of them are not even in Russia. You have a lot of people on Telegram saying Putin needs to do this and that. But I mean, it's really up to the Russian people to decide. And Putin did bring Russia from what it was after the fall of the Soviet Union to where it is now. And let me tell you, it's a far different country, to the point where people are returning from other parts of the world to live in Russia who had left during the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I do think that he deserves some credit. However, based on, for example, the conflict in Ukraine, in terms of the grain deal, for example, them reissuing the grain deal in spite of Ukraine not keeping up its side of the bargain, things like this, I do think there has to be some sort of show of, okay, you need to respect us, because if there isn't, there's going to be a loss of the population. You don't want to make Russia appear weak. So I think that's a huge part of where Putin is really having a hard time. But overall, I do think Russia is in a hard position because of the fact that anything they do is seen as aggressive already, right? So anything they do is seen as aggressive.
Yeah.
So if they remotely ever just decide to do something that is actually aggressive, the entire West is just gonna, weaponize that. So they already do, but I think it would be much worse. So I think that's also what they're doing. And Russia doesn't really pay attention to PR, and that's, I think, a double-edged sword, because they really just focus on, okay, we need to end this now. Okay, we need to end this in the least damaging way, the least blood-shedding way. And so with the exile of Prigozhin to Belarus, it really puts him outside of Russia, but it also doesn't arrest him or condemn all the Wagner. So it's kind of like that. They're always going to take the diplomatic side.
But doesn't this step portray Putin as a weaker man, because he called him a traitor and he called the act as a treason, and then he allowed him to just go to Belarus and not to be persecuted and stand in front of a court or something? I mean, in any country and in any nation and in front of any court, this is considered high treason, and he should stand like face justice, right? Like this is why what I'm reading, for example, the Russians who are critical now for Putin's decision with Prigozhin, they say that Putin now looks weak, and also other people. Like I was watching and I screened just a few minutes ago, Mario now. He had the biggest space on Twitter space yesterday, and his space was promoted by Elon Musk. And there were several speakers also. They said that Russia's Putin as we know it is over, and we have to expect a multipolar Russia now. So instead of we heading toward a multipolar world, we have to expect a multipolar Russia where there are different states, I would say, centers of power. Prigozhin could be one of them, and other people as well.
Yeah, there definitely are different centers of power in Russia. And the departments don't really go outside of their own. You have the diplomats that work for the UN, you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you have the Ministry of Defense, you have the Kremlin and what Putin does, and the Duma. You have all of these different, and they all sort of work within their own system. They don't try to overlap. I don't think Prigozhin would be a kind of leadership that would be good for Russia. And I think a lot of the comments come usually from people who are either too emotionally reactionary invested in this conflict, or people who don't really understand the power dynamic in Russia. I do think that there's definitely different positions of power in Russia, and particularly the one that people don't talk about is the oligarchy class that Putin had has had to sort of tread around, because they are the kind that will sell him out, but they're also, big in Russia. So it's I think that's something that people aren't talking about. Um, Look, I think one of the reasons why people clung on to the psyop theory is because of the Prigozhin situation. They were waiting to see what would happen to Prigozhin, if he would be arrested or taken for justice. But because he doesn't, it's kind of is strange. And this is one of the things that really I said I think he should be arrested. I think he should be held, because if this was an actual, attempt to have this mutiny of sorts and really defy the entire of the Russian military and the entire country of Russia, and put them in a vulnerable position where Ukraine could take advantage of this, that if that was what it is, then he should be punished in some way. So Belarus coming in and making a negotiation sort of says, well, the negotiation they're going to make, because they are a mercenary group, is to not be held, into any account. And of course, everybody was under the leadership of Prigozhin, but I don't think Prigozhin is the only dissenter. Meaning, I think there are other elements of the entire group that want more aggression, that want to do things in a different way. You're always going to have that. So to me, that Prigozhin was taken to and is exiled to Belarus is actually one of those things where I'm just like still thinking, like, this is really strange. He should at least be arrested. Why is this happening? It's really, I think I was afraid that if that was done, it was going to make Putin look weak. But at the same time, it almost doesn't surprise me, because, as I said, Russia does everything to try to be extremely diplomatic, almost to a fault. And I think this is one of those instances where Prigozhin should be arrested. Something should happen where he should stand trial, even if from
Mhm.
Belarus. I think that would definitely fix that perspective in terms of how people view Putin. But I do think that in spite of all of this, the overwhelming majority of people were happy that there was nothing that happened in Russia. I think as outsiders, a lot of people wanted to see Prigozhin hung in a public square, brought to justice, or some other form of spectacle. But just Russia just does not work that way. In the same way, China also does not work that way. They are not these kind of people that will do that.
Fiorella, I want to go back to this um, Twitter space of Mario, and I'm mentioning this because it's the biggest Twitter space. Millions of people listened to the discussion there. And look, we always criticize the mainstream media journalists for their very biased and wishful thinking type of reporting. But what's the difference now if the mainstream journalists and alternative journalists on Twitter are resorting to the same techniques? For example, you can see a coup updates. Putin reportedly leaves Moscow. Machine gun positions around Moscow. Wagner convoy heads to Moscow. And this is a military coup. We can no longer dispute this. And things are moving very rapidly and are not looking good for Putin. We're seeing limited military clashes, slowly likely defections among the Russian forces. Almost everything right now can't be verified and should be like everything he said. And then at the end, we should take it with a grain of salt. But Putin reportedly left Moscow. There are machine gun positions around. Wagner convoy is already in Moscow, and this spaces are now the news outlets, and millions of people have taken their information from these spaces. I'm not for, of course, any sort of suppression of speech, but how can we claim that Twitter will be the alternative for the mainstream media if the Twitter can be converted into another mainstream media type of outlet where people can have a monopoly over such type of information, thanks to, for example, Elon Musk, when he retweeted this Twitter, said this is a credible source of information, and millions of people marched into this Twitter space to follow their news. So, do you think this is made on purpose, that these journalists are misleading the public? They are misled and misinformed about Russia?
First of all, Mario is not a journalist. He was a crypto guy that decided to do Twitter Spaces and then started taking basically what the people that would mostly get speaking time on his shows are liberals and conservative, like Republicans, and the people that talk on his show most of the time don't know what they're talking about. They're just fighting and arguing, and as you mentioned earlier, the Russophobia about like coming from them. You can just listen to. A lot of them don't know what they're talking about. They really are talking theoretically about things they think about, but they're not really basing it on the facts. And so you have this sort of monopolized self called independent journalism. I don't believe it's independent. You have a team of people working behind the scenes, asking people to come on his space. And then the discussion, though, overall becomes extremely neoliberal and neocon talking points all around. And, there are some independent voices that go on there maybe to listen to see what's going on, and sometimes that get to talk on there. But really, it's overall, I don't really get much information out of this stuff. And I thought what he did yesterday or the day before into yesterday was really irresponsible. Almost everything that was said, it was entirely false. And it is done so, in my
Yes,
opinion,
it was
in
really everything he said was false,
it
without
was
exaggeration.
without exaggeration. And like, I don't, this is why, look, this is why, I criticize in the mainstream media all the time, but this is just another rehashing of that. Elon Musk doesn't just randomly support random people. This has been a well thought of plan to support him, and so he's supported him many times. He's retweeted him many times. This is why the guy has so much. It's not based on the quality of the reporting. It's based on the sensationalization of the information. And you give any subject that you want, it's done in the same way. Sensationalization, right? And so when you have tweets driven in this sensationalized form, he's not the only one that does it, but he was definitely the biggest one where people were getting their information. Now, yeah, it's shitty that people are getting their information from a man who really isn't really doing the work himself. It's like he has a team of people and they're basing it on what they read from pretty much whatever, without any sort of a confirmation, any sort of like source data. And this is why there are standards in journalism. And I'm not one to say, you have to do it like the New York Times does it or like the Washington Post does it, but there has to, you have to have a source. You have to have confirmations. This is why news outlets don't publish, like RT, they don't put out things unless things are confirmed. And the thing is, you see the opposite of that on Telegram, on Twitter, where things come out and be false, and you have people apologizing on Telegram or deleting stuff because look, sometimes we all get things wrong and we all say, okay, well, maybe this could not be true. Maybe we'll like repost,
But
not
the
post this or
intention is
whatever.
very important here. Intention
Yeah,
is very important here.
yeah.
Like,
So, but the
I
intention
have
doesn't
done
matter.
tens of mistakes in my reporting. I have done tens of mistakes in my reporting, whether it's on Syria or on Ukraine. But at no time, I tried to lie and manipulate on my audience. It was probably false reporting. It was probably false analysis, because we all miss and hit. We were human beings. But most importantly, that you have to correct it, And secondly, you need to have the good intention. And I didn't see the reporting yesterday has a
No.
good intention. I thought, like you said, it was very irresponsible. And I just want to mention this: the alleged coup that started at midnight, right? Between midnight till the second day to the afternoon, I didn't post any tweets because I thought exactly like you. It's very irresponsible now to tweet or retweet or say anything when from here, I do not know what's happening there, right? And this could cost lives of people, and people should understand Russia is a nuclear country, and Russia is a huge country, and it's a federal country, and they need to have also strong men to combine these differences between each other. It's very different place than in Western countries, and if there is a spillover from Russia into the neighboring countries, this could go out of hands. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna shut up. I'm not going to say anything. Even if my tweet can reach only 1,000 people, I'm not going to say anything about it because it's very irresponsible and words have impact. And the impact of it could be very grave on the lives of the people and also in the neighboring countries. But why I'm mentioning this, it's nothing personal. I don't know this guy at all, but because this was the biggest, let's say, Twitter space, I was shocked. I was listening for a few hours, and every person who tried to counter argue what's happening there, they were like sidelined, and most of the speakers were
Yeah.
just repeating I would say, CIA talking points on Russia, so that we have to
Yep.
get rid of Putin. Like you want to get rid of Putin? I have nothing for Putin or against Putin, right? If you want to get rid of Putin, you have to understand the alternatives and who could replace him. Like if you read the tweets of Medvedev, for example, nowadays, which was considered a not so radical politician in the past, right? And he was welcomed by all Western governments. And when you see his tweets nowadays on social media, you see, holy shit, it's good that this guy is not the president of Russia at this
Yeah.
particular moment, and it's Putin who has a calm-headed he's
Yeah.
a calm-headed person and not Medvedev
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
This
And
is
I just
Hmm.
go ahead.
I will also just mention the CIA. The CIA said something about this, and we don't know if they are genuine about this, but they say the United States suspected Prigozhin was preparing to take military action against Russia. And this is from the New York Times. American intelligence officials briefed senior military and administration officials on Wednesday that Prigozhin, the leader of the mercenary Wagner group, was preparing to take military action against senior Russian defense officials, according to officials similar with the matter. See, they don't mention Putin here, but the information shows that the United States was aware of impending events in Russia, similar to how intelligence agencies had warned in late 2021 that Vladimir Putin was planning to invade Ukraine. But unlike with the initial invasion, when US officials declassified the intelligence and then released it to try to deter Mr. Putin from invading, intelligence agencies kept silent about Mr. Prigozhin's plans. US officials felt that if they said anything, Mr. Putin could accuse them of orchestrating a coup, and they clearly had little interest in helping Mr. Putin avoid a major embarrassing fracturing of his support. What do you make out of CIA's report that they said they knew about it, they didn't tell
I
Putin,
think
they
they're
didn't want to help him?
Yeah, well, I think they're trying to capitalize on what is going on in Russia to make Russia look extremely disorganized, extremely vulnerable, to make it look like there are other forces there that do want Putin out. When again, this wasn't really about Putin. This was about Shoigu. This was about Yevgeny Prigozhin's ego. And you can go and look at a lot of statements from other officials in the military, Wagner and others, who have pretty much condemned Yevgeny Prigozhin. This is one of the reasons why I do think this was not something that was eh, done in a 5D chess move, because this man has been making countless videos. You would have to have go back almost a year where he's been doing videos. And you mentioned Putin's cool head. Well, that's exactly it. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't. The reason Putin has been in power so long is because of this
Hmm.
manner of acting. And I think Russia needed somebody like that. You can't have people that are extremely emotional and reactionary being in positions of leadership of a nuclear country. That is exactly the problem with what many, are looking at the West and the State Department and the intelligence apparatus, because they are a lot of the times extremely reactive. And I do think the CIA here is trying to capitalize on the reality that there is internal Russian conflict, as there is in any other country. But also, this is why I don't think this conflict was a psyop, because it does allow them to do that. It does allow them to weaponize that. It does allow them. Russia isn't really gaining anything from this, except that they now could see who would be betraying them. That is one of the things that I see, like, Putin would be able to look at who's really on his side or not. But I mean, I don't think anybody was, for the most part, dumb enough to take Yevgeny Prigozhin's side, save some of his men who work for him. So, I mean, other than that, like, I mean, it really didn't help Russia at all. And I do think that there is some sort of, because of what we've seen, and the way of Prigozhin's actions, the only reason that I could explain what he did is that there's some sort of like communication with some sort of intelligence apparatus via Prigozhin or via somebody else. But if that is the case, then Prigozhin is more of a threat than this little failed mutiny of sorts. And again, a lot of people were trying to sensationalize this everywhere. And just going back to the Mario thing really quick, I think that is something that we have to be wary of as journalists. And I commend you for not going and saying all these things like without knowing, because a lot of people did that. And it's to capitalize on the Twitter clicks, right? To get as many clicks as possible, to get
Yeah.
all these people. But people have to also be smarter. You can't think for a second that that somebody that's promoted by Elon Musk based on the fact that Elon Musk doesn't know anything about this conflict. He's just promoting. And it's like people have to be smart to discern this information, because with free information, the free flow of information, what also comes is your ability to discern. If you don't want people to control the information you get, you also have to be smart about how you look at it. And the people that come up and make all these things right away on a conflict they know nothing about, well, you have to start really holding them to account. And I've seen some people start doing that with Mario, where they're like, okay, you said a lot of false things, blah blah blah. And it's not hating on the guy, it's just the fact that the inaccuracy doesn't really help anybody. And as you said, it could really start a potential conflict that hurts a lot of people. And a lot of these people who want bloodshed, who want to remove Putin, they're not Russian. And that's what I wanted to say, is like the only people that can really talk about removing Putin are the people of Russia, because they live there and nobody else does. And the Russian citizens are the ones that are going to decide what they want to do. But for some reason, everybody else thinks that they can just opine on it, that Putin needs to go. Putin needs to go. It's like, well, first of all, that's not realistic. And second of all, what, this isn't your country. Like, focus. A lot of these people come from the
This is
West.
the
Focus on
point,
your country.
Fiorella. This makes me very, very, very angry when people from all around the world have an opinion about the president of the other countries. Like you can criticize
Yeah.
any, like I criticize Biden all the time or any other president, but I always like, who are you to say that Putin has to go or Assad has to go or any other president has to go? Like if you're an American, if you're a German, if you're a French, you elect your president. Why would you have an opinion? Do you see that this is some sort of intellectual or cultural imperialism that people are infected with and think that they have this they have they need to have an opinion, or they're allowed to have an opinion about other people's presidents, of how should they govern their own countries, what political system fits them? Are these people like really they have some sort of an intellectual imperialism in their minds, or they do they think that they have a moral higher ground on these countries? How do these people think?
Yeah, I think that's when I see it from Americans, I call it American exceptionalism, right? And as you said, this cultural imperialist mindset. Most of the time, I see it from the West. I rarely hear people that I've talked to from African countries or even Latin American countries that to say, "Hey, this so and so Biden has to go." Like I never hear the other side. Biden has. They might say, Biden is not really fit to be president. I think he's, he has a lot of shortcomings, but they're never like, yeah, we need to remove Biden from office. But this sort of verbiage is used by people in the United States, by people in the UK, and by people in the EU. A lot of these people feel like they have some sort of jurisdiction, and that's because our governments in this part of the world have taught us that we have a say in what happens to Putin. You saw the Atlantic and all of these Western media outlets. Russia's civil war. Putin is going. It's like, no, Putin. Like, this
with
is what
zero
they want.
casualties, civil war.
It was the U.S. 2020. What they called an insurrection in the United States was more violent, right? It wasn't really an insurrection, but it was just like, but that was more successful than Yevgeny Prigozhin zero casualties thing with Russia that was over before it started. But meanwhile, people were sensationalizing everything about this because that's what they want. They want some sort of a drama to happen in Russia. They want all of this. Russians were overall, for the most part, calm. I think I was more anxious because if anything did happen in Russia, it would just be catastrophic in terms of how so many people are putting their hope in what Russia's doing in opposing NATO. And this existential war that they are fighting, it's like, this is the underdog we want to see succeed. But that's coming from a place of really, okay, like, Russia is one of the countries that is very important for this multipolar world. And in terms of what you said in the very beginning, how can Russia be a leader in that new world if they're, if this is there? I say every country that right now is a part of BRICS that is leading people into a multipolar world has their conflicts. China has them, Russia has them, Brazil definitely has them, India definitely has them. There's not a country that is doing it perfect. There's not a country that's doing everything 100% right. The key is you don't really show that. You're not supposed to allow that to come into the public eye, really. And I think Russia, it does. Sometimes they don't look at public relations. They do. A lot of people talk about Russian propaganda. Russia is terrible at doing propaganda. They don't do it. Like, this is like, literally, that's not the kind of people they are. And it's almost like, because we're so used to like the manipulation and the PR from, the West, when we don't see that from the other side, and China, it does this as well. It's like, okay, you can see why
It's
some
mostly
people feel the
projection
need.
also. It's also projection
Yeah.
from the mainstream journalists, for example, who know quite well that they're doing propaganda and their countries or governments are doing propaganda. So they assume that other governments do the same. And I'm not saying that the Russian government doesn't want to do propaganda, but some governments are really bad in propaganda. And the Russian one is one of them. The Syrian government is like an amateur. It's like, I can do better. If I want to do propaganda, I can do better propaganda from the gym while I'm training on my mobile than the entire Syrian government, if I want to, seriously. And it's just it's not their thing. They cannot do it. And the people in Syria, they know it. The government tries to lie on the people sometimes, and the people are like, are you serious, bro? Like, we know you, it's like, you can't even lie with, with straight face. We know you cannot do it. And my last question would be, Fiorella, and I know that this is very difficult to foresee what could happen in Russia, but in your feelings and in your interactions with the people, do you think that things are going into more stability now in Russia, or there will be more struggle of these circles of power in the Russian Federation?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be more people voicing their opinions about what's happening, right? There's going to be more of a questioning. This is why I don't think this was a good thing for Russia, because it really just showcases more that there are different struggles of power, and there absolutely are. Putin is the president, but he's not alone. He's got different departments that handle different things. But I do think this did unite Russia in a way, because a lot of people were really coming together in terms of really understanding what it means to have a Russian victory, not just for Russia, but for the entire world. And a lot of people really saw how the Western media and a lot of these sensationalists fell flat on their face when you can compare what they said, 12 hours ago and then 12 hours later, where it was like, okay, it's done. And it really just shows you that Russia isn't going to let something like this distract them from their objective. But it of course also brought into question, like, okay, maybe there needs to be some sort of like a harder stance on certain things. Maybe Putin needs to do certain things to make sure that people know that he is a strong leader. I do think overwhelmingly, though, he does have the support of the people who are saying, I'm not worried about it. Putin will handle Yevgeny Prigozhin. And he did handle him, but not necessarily in the way that people wanted. And so that's something to watch out for, too, as to how that sentiment will be. Because even though there is a sector of the population that wants more aggression, there's also a sector of the population that really just wants this to end. And I think people just want, to go about to resume their normal lives, where they were able to fly from Moscow to Europe, or they were able to go so many places. Now Russians can only go to certain Arab countries, to Turkey, and to certain parts of the world. They're not allowed to go to Europe and or Ukraine. And this is something that I think has been really hard for people. And this idea of this Russophobia, where you can't use your money anywhere. I mean, I've definitely lived through it and seen it, just based on being with Russians and around Russians. And it really it hits hard when you travel outside, and you get that sort of sentiment. And but I think the reality is, this definitely unites a lot of Russians, as to what, like, we're not going to allow what the media says to dictate what we're doing. We're just going to continue doing our thing, and we're going to resolve this conflict without any bloodshed. And that really shows Russia's mindset. No bloodshed, we're going to
Yep.
end this, and that's that. And that's what they focus on, rather than the appearance of strength. They want to show strength in a different way. So people need to start understanding that that's how they work. And
Yeah,
sure,
you know,
there's criticism from within, but that's up for Russians too.
I have a feeling, I'm not sure if I'm correct on this, that Eastern people more they tend to be like, they're attracted to this strong man's character in power, and they want a stronger man than Putin. For example, in Syria, when the war erupted in 2011, people were also complaining about Assad Bashar, and saying like he's too soft in his handling of the crisis with the NATO mercenaries in Syria. And there was even some people were started to say like Bashar to the clinic, because he's a doctor, and his brother Maher he's a high-ranking officer in Syria, right? So they were saying Bashar to the clinic and Maher to the leadership, because they want this military man with badges and somebody who projects some power. And but the middle ground is always the better option for the people of Russia. Somebody has to be a balancing power in the Russian Federation and also in the surrounding, especially with the NATO countries, because a collusion or a confrontation with NATO, especially when we speak about a direct confrontation, it's not like a playground, right? Like millions and millions, tens of
Yeah.
millions of people could die. So these people do not understand this, and they're pushing things to the edge. And it's very unfortunate situation. Fiorella, I would just end up my conversation with you with the recent tweet I made just before I joined you. And these are my thoughts of what happened in the past 2 days in Russia. Russophobia is real, and there are millions of people who wish for Russia's demise or disintegration, which will have enormous negative security repercussions on the world, including on the countries that these racists live in. Two, many of these Russophobes are willing to cheer for a head of a mercenary group whom they
Mhm.
called a terrorist group. If it means the removal of Putin, they did the same thing in Syria by supporting Al Qaeda affiliates. Three, this Russophobia do not these Russophobes do not know that President Putin is a balancing power in Russia, because they don't understand the Eurasian country. If Putin is gone by a coup or in the mid of chaos, the substitute will most probably be a madman like Prigozhin, who only believes in hard power. And four, Most mainstream journalists are activists, and they have proven to be pawns of the establishment. Their reporting yesterday was pure propaganda, utter lies, and at best, based on wishful thinking. 5. If the dramatic events were an attempted coup, Russia's reputation has been gravely damaged. Moscow cannot promote itself as a leading force toward multipolarity if it can't get its home into order. But if the events were a psyop or a counterintelligence operation, NATO agents in Russia are in big trouble now. And this beautiful cat, which I learned it's a Russian cat, which is has nothing to do with the post, but I just want to
That's
throw it
really
out
good
with this.
propaganda right there. Really great propaganda.
How to promote your tweet by a cat photo
I'm gonna use
in
that
2
one.
steps.
I'm gonna use a puppy.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
I agree with everything you said pretty much, and I do think that I'm still not convinced on the psyop thing because that would just involves way too many players that really don't really have much interaction. But I do think that Russia will turn this into an opportunity rather than a
Yep.
defeat because
Yep.
they'll see now. Okay, this is what happens, and again, I'm telling you, they don't really look at perception, and they need to do that more. This shows you that you need to look at perception and how this is viewed. So I'm hoping that they get something out of that. I still think that this was presented front and center, but they're a country that is far better secure. It's far better efficiently running, living there. The transportation system, the cleanliness, the society, the way it functions is much better running than the United States, where prices have gone up on everything. Inflation is completely skyrocketing and it's really bad. It's just really bad. You see the decline. In Russia, I see a climb more so than a decline. I see things getting better. Of course, that doesn't mean there aren't problems that will be need to address. But I do think Putin, he did work for the KGB. He's not a man that is past intelligence operations. So that of course there's always that possibility. But I think there's a lot
Yep.
more that we will see coming in the next few days.
We will definitely know this in a few weeks or few months, and we will discuss that again. But up until then, Fiorella, thank you very much for your time, first of all, and your great insights on this matter. I personally really appreciate it, and also I'm sure the audience of Syriana Analysis do. And guys, her Twitter account is in the description below. Please go and follow her. At least you can also read some real information and analysis from Russia instead of going to this so-called alt media journalists who were spreading yesterday. They made me really mad yesterday when I was
Yeah,
reading for them. But yeah, it's very important to support journalists like Fiorella. She's doing an amazing job. Thank you so much, Fiorella.
thank you.
And guys, if you want to support this content, please share it on your social media accounts. And if you want to support my independent work, you can become a patron. Link in the description.